Good evening, everyone. It's Thursday night, as I did last week. I'm doing a video tonight as well about last week's or this past week's materials, as well as about what's going to be coming up in this in this coming week. So first of all, as you have seen my response and your own responses, the postings this week have been quite formidable. In almost all, I set up 4 of these discussions. Some took a little while to get started, but they have done really quite well. You've really engaged many of the issues in the book of Genesis relating to our topic. Lots of interesting comments, lots of interesting areas that you've gone into. I won't really be able to talk about all of that in this short video, but maybe some general comments that might be useful. For many of you, the theme of theodicy was present, whether or not you made use of that term. Theodicy meaning a defense of God. Often the question was posed, how could God have done that? Or why would a benevolent or just God do such a thing? And then you often go to some of the responses that Mackey actually shoots down. Good needs evil, higher good comes from a free will, second order evil or good comes from these things, and so on. There's a divine plan. We don't understand what's in God's mind, but there's always a good reason for what he wants to do, and so on and so forth. That's theodicy. That's a kind of defense of God. What's fascinating to me in all of this is that the biblical narrators don't do very much of this, if any at all. They don't seem to be bothered by these issues. Omnipotence, benevolence, omniscience, all of these things are not really biblical concepts. Even divine justice is not so easily parsed. We'll talk a little bit more about that this coming week. God is often affirmed as a God of justice, but then he does and says things that do not appear to be so just. Again, you can enter into theodicy, try to defend. But what's, again, interesting is that the biblical narrators, the biblical text itself, doesn't view this as a problem. I think that as we look at the material, as we look at how God is depicted and how human beings are depicted, what we find is that throughout these stories, everything, or so many of the stories, have moral ambiguities and moral issues, both from God's side and from the human side. You see how the stories reflect the ambiguities of real life and the stresses and concerns of parents and children and brothers and sisters. Good and bad and good and evil are presented in rather gray terms in Genesis. There is also, and I rarely use this and I'm probably wrong here, but I would say there is also never a judgment made by God or the narrator on the moral implications of behavior, human or divine. They may have sinned. God maybe will punish somebody for this, that, or the other, but think of all the problematic issues in this book. Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Abraham and Sarah, Jacob lying to his father Isaac when he brings the food, Joseph holding on to one of the brothers while sending the others back to Canaan, etc. People judge other people, and God sometimes punishes others, but there is no authorial voice judging in this case. When Jacob does what he does, when Joseph does what he does, when Abraham sends Sarah into the bed of Pharaoh, what do you hear from the text? All you have is the story. And as some of us looked at in another course, the famous essay by Eric Auerbach, Odysseus Scar, what we have in the biblical text is mostly dialogue and actions, behaviors. The author, the narrator, rarely says anything in terms of his own attitude to things. You can actually find in the book of Genesis only in a few places where the narrator himself is visible or is audible, I guess. So these are some of the general things that I think are pretty interesting throughout this. And as I said, I think lots of the issues that you raise we will be continuing to look at throughout the course and throughout the next couple of weeks as we continue to engage the biblical text. For this coming week, we're going to continue our foray into the Tanakh. We will read selections from Exodus, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, but not all of these books, just selections from them. We will be looking at the concept of covenant and the implications of covenant for the people of Israel. What does it mean to say that the people have a covenant with God? Are there responsibilities on God's part, only on the people's part? How does it work? The story of David and Bathsheba and its implications for our study we'll be looking at. What is it that David did? How did he sin? What is the relationship of God to all of this? What about the prophet Nathan and what happens to David later on in his life? And the last thing we'll be looking at is in terms of the prophets, the role of the prophets, God's relationship to the Israelite people, which seems far away from Mackey's categories, these abstract categories of omnipotence and benevolence, or maybe not. I'm going to give you 2 additional readings, as if what I have for you is not enough this week, which will address some of the issues we discussed this week and continue to discuss. The first is a Platonic, actually called a Socratic dialogue of Plato called the Euthyphro. I'm sure that many of you have read it already. The Euthyphro is one of the early dialogues. It's called Socratic because it really deals with Socrates in kind of a historical context when he was standing trial. But it deals with the question of what is the good and what is the bad? How do we understand where does it come from? When you read it, you need to replace, when he says piety and impiety, just replace that with the good and the bad or the good and the evil. And the question that gets asked there is something evil because the gods say it is? Or do the gods say it is because it already has that characteristic? Very famous and important dialogue, an important really piece of literature in Western civilization. So if you haven't read it, you should read it. If you've read it, you should read it again. The second is in a book which I mentioned in one of the discussion threads about the justice of God as depicted in the Tanakh. It's not a long selection that I'm asking for this coming week, about 10 pages. And it's about something called Theologies of Justice and depicts and shows how the concept of a just God is not so very much indicated in the biblical text itself. But instead of my telling you about it, you can take a look at it. It's in Ebrary in a book called Law and Truth in Biblical and Rabbinic Literature, and you'll see it in the assignment for next time. I'm also going to post in this discussion area where you find this, a Hebrew College master's paper by Kit Haspel, who many of you know, on the rape of Dinah, which questions the whole concept that this was considered rape in the first place. I've made some comments in the discussion threads about this, but you can read a lot more about this next, in this paper, and you can see some references if you want to follow up. We will also be beginning the Chavruta study experience this coming week, and I'll be giving you some instructions about what exactly it is that I want you to do, and so on. I've written to the people that haven't really created their Chavruta yet, and I hope that happens. I'm hoping that happens very quickly. I haven't yet set up the office hours. Probably it'll be later in the day on a Wednesday or Thursday. I'm not quite sure yet when that's going to happen. I know that it's not going to work for everybody, but we'll try to do the best we can with that. But again, congratulations on a really good first 2 weeks. Lots of interesting things. I hope that you're enjoying it too. The only thing I would say is with all of that and all the writing that you're doing now, I don't want you to burn out too much here. I don't want you, probably it would be useful to pace yourself a little bit, but keep the posts coming. I'm enjoying reading them, and I think your fellow students are enjoying reading them too. Have a good weekend, and I'll be looking forward to you'll be seeing my assignment, and I'll be looking forward to seeing your posts.